My name is Yu-Jung Cho, and I'm the chairwoman for the Illinois Competitiveness Council. Thank you all very much for being here this morning. Governor Rauner created the Illinois Competitiveness Council to cut the red tape in Illinois and make us more competitive. We are gathered here today to hear from our experts on how cutting the red tape has a direct relationship with our economic growth. Before we start, I would like to extend my gratitude to two people who have worked tirelessly to pull off this event. Christy Sweat, staff attorney, and Lene Clark, agency policy liaison for the Competitiveness Council. Thank you both very much. And if you have any questions for our expert panel, please write them down on the note card that's provided for you on your seat, and Christy and Lene will be collecting them at the end of the aisle. And also the restrooms are on, the men's restrooms on that side, and women's restroom is on that side. So, I would also like to extend my gratitude to Illinois Institute of Technology for providing us with this beautiful space. And to that end, I would like to welcome President Cram to the podium, and he's going to give us an introduction to Lieutenant Governor Sanguinetti.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Illinois Institute of Technology. It's the home of creativity, the home of students who make a difference, the home of graduates who make a difference to our country, and we're really happy to be able to host this event today. I'd like to thank the Governor's Office for asking us to do this, because I think it's important that we can be a place where people can come and hear about the latest ideas that are happening and discuss meaningful issues. I think when we look at regulatory policy, it's something that people may say, well, why would you want to talk about that? But actually, regulations are what makes everything work. And what we have to do in the university, we're under many regulations, is to make sure we comply with regulations in the easiest way possible. So when I see a discussion on how to cut red tape, I think everyone's interested in that, because that's the answer. The answer is we must follow regulations, but it shouldn't be arduous to do that. We should be able to do that in a reasonable way. So I think when I saw what the topic of this day was going to be, I thought, what a good topic, and what an exciting topic, and what an appropriate topic for this time that we do this. Before I introduce the Lieutenant Governor, I'd just like to say that the Deputy Governor for the state of Illinois, Leslie Munger, is here, and I'd like to recognize her. Leslie? So now it's my job to introduce Lieutenant Governor Sanguinetti, who's going to come and set the stage for this day. I have to say it's great to see someone who is a graduate from a law school in Chicago, but unfortunately not ours, but a good law school nonetheless. But someone who has really overcome many adversities in her life and has raised to a very high level of public leadership. And I think it's great to see people's stories of how they have managed to come from modest beginnings to a true leadership role in our state. So it's my pleasure to ask Lieutenant Governor Sanguinetti to talk to us now.
Well, buenos dias. How are you guys doing today? It's such a wonderful, bright morning. I keep on wishing it was Friday, but I don't think that's the case. I see a lot of wonderful friends out there, and today we're going to talk about red tape, but I think we see the red tape all across the lines. As soon as Bruce Rauner and I were sworn in, he actually had me chair a task force on consolidation and unfunded mandates. There's a lot of red tape going on, even with all of the layers of government we have in Illinois. Here in Illinois, we have the most layers of government, the most units of local government than any other state in the union. So it's no surprise that you see other accompanying lines. You see red tape and people who want to get businesses started here in Illinois and find that it's so difficult. And isn't it really difficult enough for you to stand up and say, I'm going to do this on my own. I'm going to be this entrepreneur that wants to get this idea started. That alone is incredibly difficult, isn't it? So it's my great pleasure to be with you today. And President, thank you. I did not go to your law school, but you know what? I do give free lectures because I'm not allowed to get paid giving lectures anymore. So I'm cheap. Have me over. Now, Our administration is deeply committed to growing Illinois' economy and bringing back jobs to our great state. We are doing all that we can to create conditions that make Illinois more cost competitive for companies to do business right here rather than in our neighboring states. We are aggressively working to cut the red tape and become more customer-friendly, or customer-centric, if you will, and make Illinois government, of course, work faster, cheaper, and better. As you will hear from our speakers today, and I've met them, they're very impressive, so have a lot of caffeine. Regulatory reform is critical to these efforts that we have here and is directly correlated to economic growth. Excess regulations drive up the cost of doing business. It also drives up the prices that consumers pay. Businesses and families often respond by doing you know what, going to our neighbors, and we simply can't have that anymore. Overly burdensome red tape discourages talented entrepreneurs from running businesses in Illinois, depriving us of their innovation and their economic competition that they could bring to our great state. This all adds up to fewer jobs and a weaker economy. Not only do excess regulations hurt our economy, but they also hurt our very own citizens. Unnecessary government rules can make it more difficult to provide health and social services for the very people who need it the most. Illinois is currently plagued with an overly burdensome regulatory environment, and I think we could all agree, based upon all of us that are here today to talk on this very issue. We have regulations for the sake of simply having regulations, and they're hindering our economic growth. It's time to cut the red tape here in Illinois. Yaisora, the time is now. To this end, Governor Rauner issued Executive Order 1613 on October of 2016 and charged all state agencies to undertake a comprehensive review of existing regulations and policies to determine which regulations are outdated, repetitive, confusing, or hindering a growing economy. And I know this is hard work, it's arduous, it's duplicative and redundant, but it has to be done. So thank you for that. The executive order established the Illinois Competitiveness Council to oversee this arduous review process. The goal of the Competitiveness Council is to attack the regulations and policies that do little or nothing to serve the public interest, but rather create financial costs or frustrations for businesses and our very own consumers. The Council is currently looking at specific regulatory issues while working with over 40 agencies, boards, and commissions to achieve at least a 20% regulatory reduction goal. Again, there you have it, folks, 20% regulatory reduction goal. To effectuate this purpose, the Council solicited assistance on a pro bono basis, i.e., that means free, on a pro bono basis from Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Mercatus has used a special software to analyze the regulatory restrictions that exist within Illinois Administrative Code and to publish a report showing which industries are most impacted by Illinois' regulations. Here to speak to us today are several scholars from Mercatus, including Chris Koopman. Chris, raise your hand. And James Brow. So, without further ado, I'd like to also let you folks know that Mercatus with Illinois has also sought advice for any regulatory reform experts around the world, like Vice President Laura Jones of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Ms. Jones was directly involved in British Columbia's successful regulatory reform initiative, and she is here with us today to share about those experiences. If you may raise your hand. Thank you for being with us. And she also said that Illinois does have the best weather today as opposed to her hometown. So Illinois does do things better. We also have Beth Kreger with us today as the director of the Institute of Justice's Clinic on Entrepreneurship. Ms. Kreger, you're there? Thank you. Ms. Kreger can speak to some of the real-world issues her small business clients have faced in Illinois due to excessive regulation. So thank you. So aside from our speakers, we're also excited to have all of you here with us today, from leaders of state agencies to business owners, industry representatives, lawmakers, community organizers, and more. You all play such an important part in raising awareness about the need to cut the red tape here in Illinois. And your interest and participation is vital, necessary to our efforts here. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Laura Jones. Welcome, Laura.
Yes, you definitely do the weather better. There's no question about that. 2 years ago, Canada did something really interesting when it comes to red tape reform. The Canadian government, and I'm talking about the federal government now, did something no other country in the whole world has done. And that is they passed a law to control the number of regulations on the books. So they passed a law saying that for every one rule that comes in, one regulation that comes in, one regulation of equivalent burden has to be eliminated. And this was such groundbreaking policy when it comes to regulatory reform that it got international attention. And I was talking to an NPR reporter who asked me about the legislation. He wanted to know more about how this law came to being. And one of the questions he asked me was, he said, Laura, I mean, how controversial was it? What kind of opposition did this have in Canada? And I said, actually, it wasn't controversial at all. All the main political parties supported it. And when Parliament voted on it, there were 245 votes in favor, which was most of the 246 possible votes it could have gotten. Only one voted against it. And it was at this point that I realized that we had done something rather special in Canada beyond just passing this groundbreaking legislation. Because the reporter, I could almost hear him falling off his chair. He was gobsmacked, and he said, "How could this happen? How could this happen in Canada?" And I think what he was really saying to me is, how could this happen in a country known to love high taxes and lots of rules without it even being the tiniest bit controversial? And the answer, of course, is it didn't just happen. It didn't just fall from the sky. In fact, what happened in Canada has very, very deep roots in a much longer running reform in the province of British Columbia, so the westernmost province. There's tons of interesting things happening in Canada right now, but the one I really want to focus on is British Columbia, because it has been going since 2001. Most governments flirt with regulatory reform. This has been a long-standing relationship we've had with regulatory reform in British Columbia. That in and of itself is unusual, but it's also had a lot of success. So I want to focus on it for that reason. But the other thing that didn't just happen, and for those of you in the audience who are stakeholders, the stakeholder support for this was a critical ingredient of success. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's another reason. This didn't just happen and happen to not be controversial in Canada. There was a lot going on behind the scenes. So why pay attention to British Columbia? Well, history is littered with failed regulatory reform initiatives, and they all had good intentions. Here's a graph that was put together, this is Mercatus data from the reg data, and put together by a new group in California that's doing some work on, particularly, they've got a great website, I think they're called the Archive Association, and I talked to them recently and they pointed this chart out to me. I thought it was great. All those little blips that you see at the bottom of the screen are different initiatives, both Democrat and Republican, at the federal level in the US to try and control the growth of regulation over time. There have been 19 of them since 1980, and yet look what has happened to the line. It is an upward sloping line. So there are just some of them pulled out. Again, Democrat, Republican, Clinton's tried it, Carter tried it, Reagan tried it, Trump is now trying it. So governments of all different stripes have tried to control regulation, largely by putting more process in place, and that's not very effective, as you can see. And I would argue that this picture is a picture you would see in almost every North American jurisdiction. I would bet my house that Illinois' picture looks just like this, as would most states, and in Canada, most provinces. So why pay attention to British Columbia? Well, in contrast to this picture, what does British Columbia's picture look like? British Columbia's picture looks like this. They have cut the number of regulatory requirements on the books by 47% since 2001. I'm going to say that again. They have cut, not added, they have cut the number of rules. While most jurisdictions have probably added by more than 47%, they have cut by 47% since 2001. And over that time period, they went from being one of the worst performing economies in Canada to now being the best performing economy in Canada. And they did it while maintaining very high levels of health, safety, environmental protection. Not all government rules are bad rules. In fact, the majority of them are actually good rules, right? It's the red tape part of it that we want to cut. And that's what they did so successfully. They got at that bad customer service, at those rules that are duplicate other rules or are unnecessary or very costly relative to the benefits they deliver. That's what they were cutting. It's a pretty impressive story. So I want to give you the bare bones of that story. How did that happen? Because it is pretty incredible. And then talk a little bit more about stakeholder engagement. So to tell you the story, I have to take you back to 2001. There was an election. And at the time, the economy in British Columbia was a shambles. So BC didn't stand for British Columbia. It stood for basket case. And it was kind of a joke. In the country. There are all kinds of problems, high taxes, deficits, all kinds of problems. But on the red tape side, even the general public, who doesn't have quite as much interaction with red tape as certainly small business owners, for example, would, even the general public was saying, we got to do something about this because it's undermining our prosperity and it's affecting our ability to have our kids aren't able to find jobs here. And this is what happens when red tape gets really bad. And so, for example, Forest Practices Code added an additional $1 billion of unnecessary costs, according to some estimates. It was the size of a small apartment building in terms of height, versus in the province next door, their Forest Practices Code was about this long. Couple of other examples. Restaurants being told what size televisions they could have in their establishments, what size the dance floors could be, golf courses, how many par 4 holes they had to have in their establishments. And one of my favorite examples is that even the children weren't exempt because you needed not 1, but 2 environmental permits to take a tadpole to show and tell. 1 to transport the tadpole and 1 to show the tadpole. So there was a lot of crazy things going on. So in that context, the government, the opposition was elected to be government, and they had made a commitment in the election campaign. They said, we commit, we will reduce regulation by 1/3 in 3 years. Now, this in and of itself was very unusual because it quantifies something that governments have not wanted to quantify. Governments talk about controlling red tape, putting in more process, but to say we're going to cut it by a concrete amount in a set time period, that was unprecedented. So here's some of the steps that they took to achieve and maintain their reduction. I'm going to walk you through this fairly quickly, but I do have more material if people are interested in more of the details. They set that 1/3 reduction target. The premier of the province appointed a minister whose only job it was to oversee making sure that election commitment would get a check mark. They determined a measure that is in and of itself the subject of a whole speech, but suffice it to say they came up with something comprehensive and credible and easy to report. And they then set a baseline, and in order to achieve that 1/3 reduction target, so they had to reduce by 30%, 33% in 3 years, they had a policy of for every one rule in, 2 had to be eliminated. That might sound a little familiar because I think President Trump has borrowed from British Columbia in some of what he is looking at doing. But so 1 in, 2 out policy until they met their target. They more than achieved their target with this cap. And one thing I want to point out here is how important the regulators themselves were in this. So the business community was bringing forward examples, of course, but it was that the regulators, who initially hated this, by the way, but they really started to get behind it. And because they knew better in some cases than where the business community did, where the real problems were. And one of them said to me, you know, it's like my job has changed from regulation maker to regulation manager, and it's a better job, right? And so they were incredibly important in this. Again, they didn't love it at first, but at one time they were running at getting rid of 5 for every 1. That's how good they were at identifying. And remember, health, safety, environmental outcomes all stayed high. So I give them a lot of credit for the success that happened in British Columbia. It really changed the culture within government, which is pretty powerful. So the baseline was then met. One other point here. In my role representing small businesses, when they were getting close to meeting that 1/3 target, I was meeting with a lot of politicians and saying, well, what are you going to do once the 1/3 target is met? And you know what they said to me? We're done. Let me ask you, how fast do you think regulatory creep would have set in again? I wouldn't be standing here telling you the BC success story if they had stopped counting and measuring. But they didn't want to set any more reduction target because 1/3 is a fair amount of rules to chop out of the system. So we said, you know what, do 1 in, 1 out. Just maintain. You've lost the weight, now maintain that weight loss. And that sometimes, as many of us can attest to, is actually harder than the original goal itself. So they agreed to do that, and as a matter of policy, they've had that in place since 2004, and they are now at 47% reduction. So the other important point here, civil servants continue to identify more to cut, even though they didn't have to. When does that ever happen? That's how fundamentally the system was changed. So the other thing they've done is they've got a really great initiative going to get examples from people. So they've got a permanent button on the website. And I think this really speaks to where Illinois is kind of starting with its reforms, which is gathering some of those examples and taking action on those examples. So I'd be happy to take any questions about that during the question period. This is just to show you the regulatory counts and how they were doing that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one. And this one shows you on their red tape reduction day, they did this fairly simply. They had, and they had the not just businesses, but the public was engaged. They had about 5,900 people go to their website, 400 examples, and they've taken action on 60 of them, and they report back what they're doing. So, and this is everything from broken links on a website to a big rule that needs to be changed. It's anything that irritates you, which is, I also think that's important. So what are the necessary ingredients for success? There are 3 of them. Political leadership, I think, hard caps on regulators, and that measurement and transparent reporting. But that in and of itself, I think those are necessary but not sufficient conditions. I think there's one other really important condition, and that is credible outside stakeholder support, pushing for change, cheerleading change, using carrots and sticks to make sure the change happens. And without that, I do not think you get sustained regulatory reform. People have asked me, are you excited that, Trump is, 2 for 1, like that comes from BC? And I'm like, I'm really not sure, because I'm not sure that the conditions for that policy to succeed are in place. I hope they are, but I'm not sure here that the general public is sold on the importance of red tape reform. I'm not sure they understand how it impacts small business owners. I'm not sure they understand how it takes time away from friends and family when you have to fill out a 10-page form instead of a 2-page form. And that's on the stakeholders that represent those important groups to tell that story. So how do you tell the story? I will tell you, I have a very, very small team. And other business associations complain about red tape, but we have gotten really, really active. We meet with politicians and their staff, and we meet with the people in opposition, not just the politicians in power. We meet with even politicians that you would think would be opposed to reg reform. And we talk to them about what it means to small business owners. We talk to them about what it means to families. We talk to reporters, and we get small business owners to tell their stories, which is not easy. I can tell you that's actually a lot of work, and it takes a lot of courage on the part of those business owners, too, to tell their stories. We publicize that research. We cheerlead success. We're creative. We make it as nonpartisan as possible. Making it partisan is not a road. The politicians may need to do that to get reelected, but you need to create the conditions that this can survive a change in government. And I'm just going to run through just quickly a couple of specific examples. We created something called Red Tape Awareness Week in Canada. Third week in January, I'd love it if Illinois joined us in having their first Red Tape Awareness Week. It wasn't hard. We just had a few things that we announced during the week. The reporters loved it because it's like, what's Red Tape Awareness Week? Tell me more about this. We got business owners to tell their stories. Again, I didn't have hundreds of business owners. I had about 10 who were willing to talk to reporters and tell their story. And we started giving out awards. Politicians love awards. And you know what? The reason there hasn't been a lot of attention to red tape cutting is there's nothing in it for politicians. Incentives matter. You've got to give them, make there something in it for them. So we created this Golden Scissors Award. It's this silly pair of scissors. It's actually a really good pair of scissors, but it's got some golden handles. You would not believe how much they love getting these golden scissors. Here I am giving it to the minister. That's an article in the paper. Look at the smile on his face. He's not only surprised that someone's saying thank you, but he's delighted that someone's saying thank you. Here's some of the newspaper clippings. You can see the woman with the teddy bears. We've actually created another award based on her bears. Her business almost got shut down because of red tape, and so we created an award. It's called the Order of the Bear in Canada, and it's I support small business with a little bear. We give those to bureaucrats who have done good work. Those are front pages of newspapers in other parts of the country, buried in red tape in Winnipeg. Lots of stories, lots of announcements, and you can see with these announcements, they're often at a small business. Everyone loves small business, as they should, by the way, so it creates a very nonpartisan way of supporting these reforms. Here I am with the former Prime Minister. I show you that one because I'm giving him our research, and I said that the one in, one out law in Canada didn't just happen after seeing our research. He created a commission. One of the recommendations of the commission was one in, one out. Of course, we were there cheerleading every step of the way. Here are some of the report cards we do. Again, this doesn't take a lot of resources. We grade all the provinces. You think that isn't a great news story? I know reporters are dealing with, fewer staff, but this, I can tell you, gets lots of news. And just last week, I'm going to end on this point. Just last week, here I am giving golden scissors to all the trade ministers across Canada, including the federal minister, we finally have a Canada free trade agreement that actually promises to reduce red tape barriers, so those stupid little things like the size of the creamer in one province is different from the size in another province, and you have to have 10 different first aid kits across Canada depending on where you're dealing with. They're doing something about it now, and I can tell you they are more excited about doing something about it now that they've been given these lovely pair of scissors to have on their desk. And it's a pretty cheap way to get politicians committed. So it didn't just happen in Canada. It happened with a lot of cheerleading from outside and some really good policy ideas from within government. So, these are the lessons I think we've learned. I've talked about most of them, so I won't go into more detail on those at the moment. But I'm going to leave you with the thought that, reducing red tape feels like a very daunting task. And in some ways it is. But I think if you have the stick-to-itiveness, pardon the pun about red tape and stickiness, but if you have that never give up, never go away kind of attitude, you can do a lot with limited resources. The BC government did not have a lot of resources to do this. They did their initial count with the help of some summer interns in 2 months. Their whole reg reform office was 4 people, and when I say 4 people, that's kind of loose because some of them had other jobs, and it was side of their desk. But the reasons for getting serious about this and the reasons for telling your stories, for those of you who are outside of government, it's too important to ignore. The picture we're seeing is not sustainable. And we can talk about the impact on our prosperity and our economic growth, and I know we're going to talk more about that in a minute. That's important, but I would argue it has even worse effects. It divides our communities, and it undermines our families when people are frustrated, and it corrodes the relationship between government and its citizens when you feel like, as I've heard from small business owners, I feel like the enemy when I'm dealing with my own government. There's something very, very wrong with that picture, and we need to fix that. So I will leave you with this, my favorite Dalai Lama quote, that if you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. And I think in Canada, small businesses have been like a swarm of mosquitoes with respect to this issue. And I have a lot of hope that you can do that here too, and you have some of the very, very great ingredients for success, including some people in your government who are very committed to this. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. My name is James Brohl. I am a research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. We're a university-based research center located just outside Washington, D.C., in Arlington, Virginia. And I'm involved in a project called Reg Data, or State Reg Data, to quantify the level of regulation across the 50 states. We haven't gotten to all 50 yet, but we've looked at a handful, including Illinois. And so I want to talk a little bit today about what we've found as far as how much regulation exists in Illinois and other states, and also talk about a process by which states that want to reduce levels of regulation can go about doing so. And this process is modeled in large part on the efforts we heard about in British Columbia. Now, to start off, I want to emphasize that when we talk about reducing levels of regulation, I'm not talking about eliminating all regulation. There's obviously many regulations that serve a very useful and vital purpose in terms of protecting health, safety, and the environment. What we're really talking about is reducing red tape, which is unnecessary regulatory burdens. These are rules that impose costs. They're just disproportionate to the benefits that they produce, or that maybe aren't really addressing a real or systemic problem, or maybe the problem that they were intended to address has gone away over time such that they're outdated. And the problem with too much red tape piling up on the books is that it can create a drag on economic growth. And we care about growth not just because we want to make GDP bigger, but because this has important implications for citizens' quality of life, for living standards, and for opportunity. Just by way of background, Illinois has had pretty slow growth over the last decade. It's averaged about 0.7% per year, which is trailing the nation as a whole, which itself has had pretty slow growth over the last decade, about 1.3% per year. So Illinois is growing at just a little over half of the nation's growth rate. This is a problem because it means that eventually, Illinois is trailing other states. Eventually, other states are going to surpass even Illinois' income levels if these trends continue long term. So as I mentioned, I'm involved in a project to try to quantify the level of regulation across the 50 states. So this is actually a very new effort. No one's done this before. And the way we're doing this is we're using computer programs to scan through bodies of state regulatory code. And we need computer programs because most regulatory codes are just simply too long to read for practical purposes. So for example, the Illinois regulatory code would take over 20 weeks to read from start to finish if that was your full-time job. So that may not be the best use of a researcher like mine's time to spend 20 weeks reading a regulatory code. It's not even clear at the end of that process that I would really have a full understanding of what all of this regulation means. And what we do is we use computers to try to pull out key information. So we can pull out information on word counts, on restrictive word counts. These are words like shall, must, or prohibited that can signify legal requirements of some kind. We can search for keywords that are relevant to specific industries to figure out which industries are the most targeted by regulation. And we can figure out which areas of regulation, broadly speaking, health, safety, financial regulation, occupational licensing, where are the biggest areas of regulation. We have looked at 4 states so far: Kentucky, Missouri, Virginia, and Illinois. The first 3 we looked at were Kentucky, Missouri, and Virginia. And we started to see a trend as we were looking at these different states. We saw that each state had about 125,000 of these regulatory restrictions in their code, and they averaged about 7.5 million words in terms of the length. So we thought, oh, well, it looks like there's somewhat of a comparable level of regulation across the different states. Then we got to Illinois. And Illinois has about double the level of regulation as the other states we've looked at so far, about 259,000 regulatory restrictions, about 15.5 million words. And it's worth noting, I mean, there's an effort that we heard about from the Lieutenant Governor to reduce regulatory restrictions by 20% in the next couple of years in Illinois. But even a 20% reduction would still leave Illinois with over 200,000, or roughly 200,000 restrictions, which is still considerably higher, maybe 50% higher than the other states we've looked at. Pennsylvania is the next state we're working on. I think it's going to come in around 150,000. Okay, so with this in mind, Illinois, just as background, Illinois is experiencing somewhat slow growth relative to the rest of the country. It has about double the regulatory burden of at least the states that we've looked at so far. So it's not surprising that Governor Rauner and other public officials are considering reducing regulatory red tape in order to maintain competitiveness with the states around it. So how might we go about doing this? So I'm going to outline a fairly simple and straightforward process that involves 6 steps to reducing regulatory burdens. Now, this is not the only process that could conceivably be followed, but it has some advantages in that it's based in large part on the British Columbia experience. It's fairly simple, and it's not going to involve lots of additional expenditures by the state government. So step 1 is define what we mean when we talk about regulation. Now, this may sound simple, but in fact, regulatory burden can be defined in many ways. The most obvious manner is probably some estimate of cost, but just estimating cost is difficult. It requires analysts. Do you have to add up the cost for every regulation on the books? That's complicated. So a much simpler method is to use something like regulatory restrictions, which we use in our Reg Data program, or regulatory requirements, which was the model that the British Columbia system followed. With a measure of regulation in place, then it makes sense to estimate how much regulation actually exists. This is a baseline. This is a starting off point for evaluating regulatory reform efforts to see if they're making progress over time. If you don't know where you start off, then you're not really going to know if you've made any progress. So if Illinois has 259,000 restrictions on the books, that's a baseline. In a year, in 2 years, we can look back and see whether the level of regulation went up, went down, or stayed the same. Then it makes sense to set a firm goal and a deadline for how much to reduce regulation by. Without a goal in mind, and we heard Laura talk about how many politicians they're reluctant to set a firm goal because then you can be held accountable later on. So most of the regulatory reform efforts we've seen at the federal level in the United States usually involves saying, let's reduce regulatory burdens, but there's no quantification involved. So it makes sense to set a target and set a date for when that target can be achieved in order to hold the policymakers accountable. Now, there's several models you could follow. One would be to follow the British Columbia experience to reduce regulatory requirements or restrictions by a third within 3 years. That's one model. Or you could look at nearby states and say we want to have a level of regulation comparable to some of our competitors, something along those lines. It also makes sense to have some kind of oversight body in place. Now, this could be an existing office in the executive branch, in a governor's office. Sometimes there are regulatory review bodies that exist. There could be a legislative committee, or it could be a new council, like a competitiveness council, like it's been set up in Illinois. Sometimes states like New Jersey a few years ago set up a red tape reduction commission as well. So there should be some kind of body to ensure that the targets, the goals from step 3 are being met. They should be reporting back to the governor and the legislature about progress of the reform effort, and also be involved in communicating with the public, explaining the benefits of regulatory reform, gathering information from stakeholders, from small businesses, from individual citizens about regulations that might be unnecessarily burdensome. So in many ways, those first 4 steps are kind of the easy part. They're like the foundation. The hard part is actually going through the regulatory code itself and identifying the actual regulations that should be removed. Now, in theory, the oversight body could do this. It could be the Competitiveness Council or a red tape commission, but there's going to be a steep learning curve involved. The people on this commission might not know all of the specific ins and outs and of all the different titles of the regulatory code. As a result, it probably makes sense to have the regulatory agencies themselves be the ones who actually review the code and identify the regulations that need to be removed. But, of course, there might be resistance from the regulatory agencies. They wrote most of these rules, after all. They've been enforcing them. They may feel a sense of personal attachment to many of the regulations issued. So just telling the agencies to go back and review the rules on the books may not be enough. And as we heard, every president, going back to Jimmy Carter, has had some sort of regulatory review initiative that often involved an executive order that said, regulatory agencies go back, eliminate rules that are, holding back business or that are holding back the economy. And every president going back, at least to Franklin Roosevelt, has left office with more regulation in place than they entered office with. The general trend is just for the level of regulation to rise. So just telling regulators to eliminate rules is probably not enough. There needs to be some kind of formal mechanism in place to change the incentives of regulators, to induce a culture change. And that's the kind of one in, two out policy that we heard about. These are sometimes called a regulatory pay-go system or regulatory budgeting system. And this can help the regulators achieve their targets so that the goals outlined in step 3 are actually met. And then once the regulatory, once a reduction in the level of regulation has been met, this will be a big accomplishment if it happens in Illinois or happens anywhere. But once the regulators have successfully hit the target, then it makes sense to institutionalize this process so that we don't just kind of return to the status quo of adding more and more rules to the books over time. And this is the general trend we see across states or countries, is that regulators view it as a major part of their job to write rules rather than be rule managers. And so we instituting something like a permanent one-in, one-out rule or permanent regulatory pay-go system can help change the institutions and permanently lead to a culture change among regulators. So those are 6 steps. And how is Illinois doing on this front so far? This may be what you're most interested in. So Governor Rauner has issued an executive order tasking regulatory agencies to go back and review all their existing rules on the books and report back by next month about rules that could be updated or modified or eliminated. There's also this relatively informal target, I would say, to reduce regulatory burdens by 20% in 2 years. And then there's been an oversight Council created, the Illinois Competitiveness Council. So we've got in place some of these elements of the steps that I've talked about. There isn't a formal measure of regulatory burden that's been set, nor has there been an official baseline established, although work that we've done at the Mercatus Center could help establish these things. So regulatory restrictions could be the measure. 259,000 restrictions could be the baseline established against which you could track whether this 20% reduction has actually taken place. Probably a bigger challenge for Illinois will be getting buy-in from the regulatory agencies and instituting the permanent kind of culture change that I've talked about. One way, now, as I mentioned, it could be there's an executive order in place which is requiring them to go back and look through the books, but that may not be enough. So instituting something like a regulatory pay-go system could help spur the regulators to actually help achieve that target. But even a regulatory pay-go system may face some hurdles. So Illinois has a somewhat unique system in that they have a legislative committee called the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, which also has to approve all new regulatory actions, including deregulatory actions. And so this committee could potentially slow down or create a hurdle for efforts to reduce the level of regulation, even if once buy-in from the regulators occurs. And so this also stresses the importance of getting buy-in from the legislature as well, and also probably highlights why it's so important to get stakeholder involvement, as we heard, and get public support as well, so that the legislature feels some pressure that this is a priority. Now, perhaps one way to overcome some of the hurdles that might be created by this legislative review of regulations would be to have some kind of fast-track authority for deregulatory actions. Maybe it would be, it could be done on a temporary basis. It could also help to have the JCAR involved in an oversight capacity, perhaps working with the Competitiveness Council. So if they feel that they are bought into this regulatory reform effort, if they're a part of the process, maybe they could even have an ongoing role in the process going forward. These could all be things that help get legislative involvement. If none of these options work, then it's also worth pointing out that the administrative rulemaking process in Illinois is somewhat unique in the sense that a legislative committee has some veto authority over new rulemaking. And this raises constitutional questions. It can raise separation of power issues. Other states that have had systems like this in place have sometimes run into problems in the courts or had to amend their constitutions even. So there could be a role for the courts to get involved if legislative hurdles make it too hard to implement regulatory reform. So those are some of the challenges that Illinois faces. But just to kind of get back to the original reason why we're talking about all of this, which is raise the economic growth rate and create more opportunity for Illinois citizens. So before British Columbia embarked on its regulatory reform effort, we heard a little bit from Laura about how the economic growth was kind of stagnant. And there was a period in the 1990s where people referred to it as a dismal decade in British Columbia because of stagnant growth and limited opportunities. And British Columbia's growth rate, like Illinois', was lagging the country as a whole, the country of Canada in this case, by about 2% a year. And after the regulatory reform effort, in the years following, it became better than average. It was ahead of the average growth rate by about a percentage point. And the absolute numbers tell a similar story. So pre-reform, British Columbia was averaging about 2.5% growth. And keep in mind that this was their dismal decade, and Illinois is experiencing about 0.7% growth a year right now. But after reform, that shot up to about 3.8%. And now I'm not going to claim the regulatory reform was the only thing that was going on during this period. There were clearly other factors involved. There were some tax reform efforts. But what this highlighted is that regulatory reform was associated with a turnaround in economic performance. And perhaps more impressive was that British Columbia maintained maintained top rankings in terms of health and environmental outcomes among provinces in Canada for years following this reform effort. Now, these small increases in growth rates, a percent and a half, it may not sound like a big deal. You may think, well, what's it really matter if the GDP grows 1% more per year or not? Now, it takes 12 or 18 years for the GDP of a country or an economy in general to double if it's growing at 4%. So if you could imagine, if you have a child, by the time that child goes to college, the economy could be double the size if the economy is growing at 4% a year. At 3%, that increases to 24 years, which is 6 years longer. At 2%, it's 35 years, almost half a lifetime in many ways. At 1%, it's 70 years to double GDP. So how long would it take to growing at a rate of 0.7%, as Illinois has been growing over the last decade? It would take a century, longer than a lifetime for most of us. So these are the kinds of things that are at stake with regulatory reform. That's all I have. Thanks.
Hi, we are going to move to our next speaker, Adam Thier, and we'll take Q&A at the end of the session.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Thier. I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. My role here today is to just set the table for a discussion with Chris and Beth about innovation and opportunity in Illinois. First, I want to say it's great to be back in my home state, my birth state. I was born here in Peoria in 1969, or as my children call it, the olden times. Anybody born before humans set foot on the moon is equivalent to the olden times, according to my children. But no, it's great to be back here, and being born in Peoria is a great little thing because whenever you're in Washington and somebody says, I wonder how this will play in Peoria, I say, I'm here. I'll give you the answer. No, it doesn't really work, but it's a good way to break the ice. But I'm here to talk to you first about something that's a dominant theme of everything we do at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and everything that economists, political scientists, economic historians, business theorists do, which is they think about the so-called big question. And the big question in the field of economics, political science, and business theory is, as defined by my colleagues Matt Mitchell and Pete Betke in a new book, Applied Mainline Economics, the big question is this: why is it that some societies are so fabulously wealthy while others are so miserably poor? And this is what economists and political scientists and business theorists have struggled with for centuries. Going back to the time of Adam Smith and others, they've always thought about this question. And to cut right to the chase, the answer that most of them come to is that the reason that some societies grow so much faster than others, are so much wealthier than others, so much more prosperous than others, is because of innovation. And as James just documented in some of the statistics he cited, there's a symbiotic relationship between innovation, economic growth, and human well-being. And that ultimately, in order to unlock more innovation and therefore more economic growth and more human well-being, we have to get our institutions and our attitudes right. That's really what powers innovation in nations, in states, and even in local economies. Well, what's the key to getting institutions and attitudes right? I believe it comes down to getting an attitude towards innovation and entrepreneurialism right that some people have referred to as permissionless innovation. It's an idea, I did not coin the term, I've happened to have written an entire book about it that's free and it's out there, I think, available to you. But basically what I've been looking at over the last quarter century is how technology and innovation has occurred within the internet and emerging technology sectors that I've covered in the United States and abroad. And there's been this amazing experience that's happened over this quarter century, primarily because of the rise of the internet, that hasn't happened everywhere uniformly. Some nations have grown their information technology markets and internet-enabled technology spaces much more rapidly than others, and this has helped broaden consumer choices, entrepreneurial opportunities, and economic growth. And I've specifically focused on how this has happened in a sort of transatlantic clash between the United States and Europe, and focused on how hard it is to even name many entrepreneurs or major companies from Europe the way you can in the United States. In fact, US-based companies, whether it's Google and Facebook and Apple and so on and so forth, they're household names across the globe. And these companies have provided a great deal of prosperity to the United States, an amazing range of choices and options here across our nation and across the world. Meanwhile, like I said, it's a real struggle to even figure out who are the major innovators and entrepreneurs of some of these other countries. That's had an effect on consumer well-being and well-being more generally, and innovation and economic growth in a lot of these countries. But that story has played out many times over before and since the rise of the internet in many different other areas, and it plays out in a smaller way at a state-by-state level across the United States and across other geographic units. And so how do we unlock this mystery of innovation, economic growth, and expanded human well-being on a state-by-state basis and help Illinois prosper? How do we get our institutions right? How do we get our ideas right? And one of those things comes down to the question of getting rules right, getting institutions and regulations right. It doesn't mean eliminating all regulations. It means trying to find a way to bring some sensibility to the regulations. Because if regulation is dominated by what is sometimes called a precautionary principle mindset, which is that you're not allowed to do anything until such time as you can prove that no theoretical harm will come about, well then guess what? The problem with letting the precautionary principle dominate as our innovation policy is that it means that in an effort to stop any hypothetical worst case scenario from happening, you end up stopping all the potential best case scenarios from happening. And this is, I love the example that Laura gave of the tadpole regulation. At some point, somebody somewhere thought like, you know, hypothetically, some kid could bring a tadpole to class and eat it, or, you know, they might drop it and somebody could slip and fall. Sure, there's a hypothetical worst case scenario you could put together to explain every possible regulation in the world. But how realistic is it? And is there a better alternative to address that problem? That's the secret to unlocking a more rational regulatory system, or getting from, how did you put it, from regulatory mayhem to regulatory management. I think that's exactly what we need to do, because so much regulation today is a state of mayhem and utter confusion. That's what red tape is so problematic for. You can't even understand it. It's so complicated. We have to find a way to have more rational regulation, manage regulation in such a way that we allow our institutions to unlock entrepreneurial opportunities for our communities and our states, and therefore propel economic growth and human well-being. So I just wanted to use that to set the stage for the discussion with Beth and Chris. Beth and Chris both study these issues, work on these issues quite actively, and they deal in the weeds of these issues about when you're faced with serious restrictions on entrepreneurialism and business formation. These are two people that are ultimately there, sometimes in courts or filing papers and suits, basically trying to defend the rights of those who have struggled against the regulatory leviathan and all that red tape. So Beth, let me turn to you first and talk to us about your experience and how on a day-to-day basis you deal with this, or how it's sort of the human interest side of this, the kind of people that you deal with who face these restrictions.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to be here and join this conversation. I am the director of the Institute for Justice Clinic on Entrepreneurship, which is based at our rival school, the University of Chicago, down the road. And we're part of the Institute for Justice, which champions economic liberty. We fight as hard as we can in the courts, in the communities, and on the streets to make sure that entrepreneurs with creative ideas, entrepreneurs with a dream of making it on their own, being their own boss, doing something a little different and a little better than people have done before in their communities, that those people have the freedom to do those things. And at the IJ Clinic on Entrepreneurship, we work with law students to provide free legal assistance for low-income entrepreneurs, support for those entrepreneurs in the community, and advocacy. We're a watchdog for low-income entrepreneurs in Chicago and around the state of Illinois. And as a watchdog, I'm afraid we're on alert way too much in the state of Illinois. Every day we're working with entrepreneurs who have great ideas, they've got passion, they've got drive, but they haven't got big budgets. And when they run across a tangle of rules and regulations that seem to be, and sometimes are, designed to keep them out of business, it's incredibly discouraging. And I unfortunately have example after example of these clients that I work with, community members that I meet, who have struggled and struggled to understand the rules. I can even tell you stories about how University of Chicago law students are struggling and struggling to understand these rules, and just foiled in the attempt to make a living for the family, put food on the table, provide a valuable service or product for the neighbors, or maybe even change an industry.
Beth, maybe you could provide an example of how maybe you have litigated some of these cases, or some stories about how this has affected real folks here in Chicago and across Illinois.
Absolutely. So we're working in the IJ Clinic to help people get started, help people build their businesses. And one of our clients is an immigrant to this country. He decided to put himself through college by putting an ad in Craigslist and saying that he would, provide moving services for folks. As he said, when you come to this country, you've got your muscle, and if you're willing to put it to work, you should be able to do that for people. He was shocked, of course, when he was stopped by someone from the Illinois Commerce Commission, an officer, gun and all, who said, where are your papers? Where's your authorization to move household goods? He said, I had no idea there was such a thing. And that started him on a twisty, crazy road to get the authority to be a moving company in Illinois, which he's the first to say is something that is something people can do with muscle. And the bodies that they have without the big budgets, you have to have a hearing, and you have to prove that you have trucks and you have all of the equipment in place. You also have to prove that people can't move their stuff unless you get permission from the state of Illinois to do it for them. You have to bring witnesses to testify that they can't move unless there's this new business in the marketplace. And then you have to put your prices into these complex formulas. You might think that that was there so that customers would be able to know exactly what they were going to be charged and couldn't be conned after they've put all of their possessions on the truck. But our well-educated, smart, and savvy client can barely understand his own pricing structure because it's so complicated. It's certainly not transparent to the customer. So even after getting through these barriers to get his authorization, I could mention too that he was held up by months because his paperwork wasn't quite right. One of the problems was that he wasn't writing the phone number of his customer in 2 different places on the same form. He would write it only in one place. And he spent hours with the Association of Movers trying to figure out how to do this paperwork so that he could be a moving company. And even after going through that process, he's not allowed to offer discounts. He's not allowed to change his prices for senior citizens or for students moving into school in the fall. He's not allowed to charge by the hour when he's packing things up for someone. He has to follow the formula that requires him to charge differently for each size box he's using. So here's an example of someone who is committed to building a business the right way and has just been stymied at every turn. And I know I'm going on, but it's that kind of story. But I can't leave out the fact that his workers' compensation premiums are over 30% of his payroll. So that's not counting insurance for if he bangs up a truck or if he breaks someone's property. He has to pay over 30% of what he pays people. And that makes it almost impossible to hire people and grow.
That's amazing. So Chris, at the Mercatus Center with me, you study a lot of these issues. There's a lot of different types of certification processes, licensing, permitting processes. You've studied these extensively across the states. I mean, what are your general findings about these regulations, these permitting rules, what they've done to innovation, entrepreneurialism opportunities in Illinois and elsewhere?
Yeah, so a couple of points on this, and just to build on something Beth said, and this is a clear point that's been made a number of times already today, but the regulatory accumulation just causes confusion on the part of regulators, on the part of entrepreneurs, small business. You know, when we think of entrepreneurship, we think of this, right? Tech hubs, internet, big I innovation, you know, this type of stuff. But entrepreneurship and innovation is something as simple as taking your F-150 and driving boxes around for money, right? Cutting someone's hair, right? So to give you an example of the type of confusion, both on the regulatory side and on the regulated side, that people who have to deal with this stuff, is something like cutting hair, being a barber. I might be surprising. I don't go to one. I don't get my hair cut by others. I do it myself. But I have heard that people go and they get their hair cut for money. You need a license to do that, right? To charge, to be compensated to cut someone's hair, you have to get a license. Illinois, almost every state does this. Now, in a lot of high-end type places, even low-end, like Sport Clips, these types of places do this as well. The end of your haircut, they put a hot towel on your face. They might rub your shoulders, your head a little bit, you know, nice relaxing time. Now the question, are they now practicing massage therapy? Do they need 2 licenses? If you're a barber that's, let's say, 80 years old and you've been doing this forever, and all of a sudden a new licensing comes out, where do you fit in? As a regulator, do you know, are barbers massage therapists? I mean, let's say you are, you just trim someone's eyebrows and you're a beautician, right? If you use clippers, you somehow trip into the definition of being a barber or a hairstylist, do you now need that license as well, right? These things are very confusing even for regulators who are trying to do a good job, right? These are people who are trying to protect health, welfare, safety, but they're spending more time and energy trying to figure out how to fit into this system that they can't actually focus on doing their jobs. I would say also it's not just confusion for the regulators in this context. A big area we've talked about is certificate of need. We've been looking at this across the country. Illinois is one of the 35 states that have certificate of need laws. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with these. They're healthcare regulations that essentially act as a permission slip to compete. Let's say you're a doctor in Gary, Indiana, and you want to expand into Chicago. Let's say you have freestanding clinics or something, and you want to expand into an otherwise underserved or unserved community. There's no clinic there, and you want to open one up. You can't. The first thing you have to do before you can open an ambulatory surgery center in the state of Illinois is go before a board and prove, similar to what Beth was talking about with the mover, improve that that community, quote unquote, needs your services. This ends up looking like full-blown litigation. You have to hire attorneys, right? It's a job protection for us, but what a shame for these people. You have to hire attorneys, you have to go through this process. All the other providers in the neighborhood get an opportunity to say, we don't need more competition. Right? Now, what does it say? This hurts. If I'm in Gary, I'm like, I'm going to stay in Gary, right? Indiana doesn't have these. Wisconsin doesn't have these, right? Your neighbors, Illinois is better than Iowa. Okay, you're worse than all your other neighbors. Where do you fit into this when people would say, I could do it on the east side of the border or the west side of the border and not have to deal with this? So you see this effect on innovation and entrepreneurship where it's going somewhere else, right? People are going to choose to go somewhere else as a result.
Yeah, that's right. It's something we've documented in some of our work at Mercatus we call innovation arbitrage. It's just the idea that just as capital can move around pretty easily, increasingly across borders, so too can innovation and innovators. Mm-hmm. So there's a real risk to the competitiveness of the state when you're losing the best and brightest or just great ideas to neighbors because they just frustrated with the burden. But there has been some sign for optimism, Chris, in some of the things you've been doing recently. You've been documenting how some states have turned a corner. There's also been litigation that has gone all the way to the Supreme Court that's dealt with some of these issues having to do with state licensing bodies. There's now efforts underway among many states to actually try to bring some sensibility to this, clean up this mess a little bit. Can you briefly describe that?
Yeah, so I would say across the country, right, Illinois is not alone in thinking long and hard about the regulatory burden on businesses. This is happening across the country, and it's bipartisan, right? These regulatory reform initiatives are not something that is a red issue or a blue issue. This is something that the Obama administration has talked extensively about occupational licensing reform because it affects people, right? Lower income individuals are hit hardest by these. But something we haven't talked about is the effect it has on consumers, right? These are hurting people. I think the lieutenant governor said before that most people don't interact with red tape on a day-to-day basis. I would say we do. As consumers, everything that we do is affected in ways that we don't even understand. Oftentimes it takes economists and lawyers to come up with very fancy models and regression tables to pinpoint exactly how they're affected, but they are. And so you've seen a number of states go after certificate of need laws, for example, because it affects the health outcomes, right? You see people they're driving further, they're paying more, and they're getting worse health care because of these regulations. And so you see a number of states. New Hampshire has been the latest to repeal these, but 35 states and DC still have them. That means that there have been 15 states over the last, let's say, 20 years that have decided these no longer fulfill a purpose because they've looked and they said there's no nexus here. There are also, willing partners that are helping states get this right. The FTC has spent a long time.
The Federal Trade Commission.
The Federal Trade Commission, right? It's a federal agency that deals with competition and consumer welfare. And they've dealt a long time with these issues for 30 years. And there have been some recent changes, some recent Supreme Court cases that have put the onus on states to fix it now, like to get this right, because you will spend a lot of time and energy in court defending these, because the FTC in a recent Supreme Court decision has been given broader, increased ability to sue states that have these licensing boards that are engaging in anti-competitive behavior.
Right.
So there's a willing...
On the grounds that there are restraints on interstate trade and commerce.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That they're negatively affecting, that they're unfair methods of competition, mm-hmm. as the court would talk about them, that they're negatively affecting the flow of commerce.
And then we should also mention that you mentioned the FTC, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission has recently created a economic liberty task force that is charged with looking at these sorts of state and local barriers to innovation. Mm-hmm. And then also recently, President Trump has announced an Office of Innovation Policy. Is that what it's called?
The Office of American Innovation.
Yeah. I don't really know what that means quite yet, but there is increasingly an interest in Washington to look into barriers to innovation, although it's unclear how much Washington can or should do relative to the states on this front. That's a more controversial topic. Mm-hmm. But let me ask a different question. Let me play devil's advocate, and Beth, I'll go to you first, and then Chris can answer and say, well, wait a minute. There's a compelling public interest case to be made for these rules. These aren't just craziness. This is, we need to have public health protected. We need to have restrictions or permitting processes so we know that public health, safety, whatever is protected before these things are allowed to go forward. I mean, what do you say to that, Beth?
I do believe that most of the regulations and rules that we're talking about have been created in a genuine effort to protect health and safety. But I think this is where we have to get back to the points that Laura made, that you kind of need to change your culture. To create that culture of innovation, you have to let people experiment. You have to let them fail. You have to let them try new things. So the health and safety rules need to be kind of general and broad to protect health and safety only, rather than defining line by line exactly how a business should operate. And there are so many problems. If you define exactly what a funeral home looks like and exactly what a barber shop looks like, of course you're inhibiting innovation. If you require 2 years of school to do something and the schooling isn't relevant, barbering is, I think, 1,500 hours of schooling, and that's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to squeeze out people who might have new ideas but can't afford to go to school instead of working for 1,500 hours. So you've got to think about whether these rules are actually directly about health and safety, or they're kind of defining work and defining these businesses so that people, one, can't innovate, and two, are frozen in time. These rules are also often written with the advice of the people already in the industry. That makes a lot of sense. But they're going to kind of encapsulate how they operate, which is what they believe is the best practice. But that's in the moment. And so it's always hard to come up with, well, how might this be done differently in the future, and leave room for that. We, by the very nature of the future, don't know what someone might try that's never been done before. But we have to be very conscientious about writing the rules so that they require health and safety and customer protections without defining the businesses in great detail.
Chris?
Yeah, so I agree. Most of these rules, right? Even the tadpole ones, like you said, very, very well intentioned. Like people almost always going into these things with the best of intentions. However, I would say the point here is not to measure these programs by what they intend to do. The point should be to measure these programs by what they actually do. Intentions, not outcomes. That's what matters. And oftentimes, let's go back to Certificate of Need. Certificate of Need is a perfect example of this. Throughout the 60s and 70s, these laws were put in place to increase access. We were told it was going to protect rural care in underserved communities, right? Very, very, very important. But what you find is rural communities, you get out of Chicago, you go to rural communities, you find fewer ambulatory surgery centers and hospitals in those communities. We can look at the data, control for everything else, and say that these laws are associated with a 30% drop in available hospitals, 15% fewer freestanding clinics, right? You start to measure these things by their outcomes and not their intentions. You find it raises the cost of care for a state, right? Medicare is more expensive. Physician care is more expensive in these instances. You start measuring them by their outcomes. It becomes very easy to look at these and say, okay, we intended to do something really good, but as they say, the road to heck is paved with good intentions, right? You can intend everything you want, but if it's not achieving it, you should probably stop doing it. And again, I think it goes back to entrepreneurship and innovation as well. You end up finding you create these licensing structures that allow stakeholders, incumbent stakeholders, to have a say in the future of it. They spend a whole lot of time involved in controlling the future of that licensing board, of the decisions made by the health department when they're making Certificate of Need decisions. That's money that could be going to buying new machines, buying better machines, opening new locations, but instead they're engaged in unproductive entrepreneurship. Things that they're being entrepreneurial, just not achieving what we hope entrepreneurs achieve.
And I think the other part of the story here, and you're welcome both to elaborate on this, is that we have to consider if there are alternative remedies to some of these complex problems. This is something that, when you deal in the world of hypothetical worst-case scenarios and base public policy upon them, you can get quite tied up in trying to answer all these things preemptively with prescriptive rules, and that's where red tape is born. But the genius of the American common law system is the fact that we usually let some of these things run their course, see if any bad things happen, and then we do come up with solutions or litigate when things go wrong. And indeed, this is the internet model, right? We didn't have a federal internet commission. We didn't have a federal social networking commission or smartphone commission. We have allowed most innovation in the digital space in the United States to happen without prior permitting or certification of any sort. And it's worked out fairly well. We don't live in a state of anarchy. There are still problems when things happen. We litigate, or the U.S. Federal Trade Commission or state AGs actually intervene, and there's consent decrees. Or maybe softer touch things. Maybe there's best practices that are suggested for how to change behavior in a certain way. Maybe there are task forces put together, other things like this. This is a sort of new model of governance that is sort of evolving for a lot of modern technologies that I cover, but it seems to be a more effective one because it doesn't have the prescriptive, preemptive type of red tape that says, thou shall not, without getting someone's blessing first.
Yeah, I think one thing I keep in mind, especially in a state like Illinois, which is not alone in having extensive regulation of barbers and cosmetologists, you can say the difference between a good haircut and a bad haircut is 2 weeks. If someone gets a bad haircut, they can get another haircut or wait a little while, wear a hat, or sue. But
Or you can complain online, right? You've got other mechanisms to.
Well, that's exactly right.
You live in a world of Yelp and,
Exactly right. I think that's a very important point for us to consider because one theory of how these rules started kind of multiplying was that when we moved into cities, we didn't know anymore who was trustworthy. We didn't know the barber who'd been the barber on the corner since we were little kids. We didn't know the butcher and so forth. But now with social media and these kind of review sites, we've recaptured some of that. You can learn a lot about businesses and the quality of the services they've provided other people. And so the government doesn't have to do as nearly as much screening as they used to do. And here's an example that's live in Illinois right now. So the Department of Financial and Professional Regulation is charged with determining whether or not there should be a license in Illinois for music therapists. So a license would require people to meet certain qualifications before practicing music therapy. And the committee that's been gathered together to talk through this issue includes music therapists and other kind of licensed therapists. So you can imagine there might be kind of a bias there for the importance of codifying these kind of standards of practice. And when I talked to them, I said, well, think about some consequences of limiting the practice of music therapy to people who had gone to school, gotten a college degree in music therapy and so forth. If someone in Englewood in Chicago wanted to start a program where accomplished rappers worked one-on-one with youth to help them compose raps and kind of deal with some of the trauma that they've experienced by expressing themselves through art, that program would be shut down because those mentor musicians would not be music therapists. Again, it's always hard to come up with an example of what hasn't been done yet, but I said, what if someone came up with an algorithm so computers could, through a sensor on your wrist, kind of pick up your biofeedback and figure out kind of what music might help ease your depression or your anxiety.
There's an app for that. Yeah.
It's happening. And within weeks after I mentioned both of these things, I read articles in the newspaper about music programming for a traumatized youth and about technology that could do some therapeutic kind of advising or shaping for people with problems. So it's an example where the rules are being written kind of by or with the advice of the people who are already doing it one way and have a great potential to shut out people who might do it a different way.
And I think, another really, really important point to keep in mind here is that a lack of regulation does not mean that the industry is unregulated. I mean, you scale back regulation does not mean that they're going unregulated. So think about it. How many of you, when you interact, let's say, with your beautician, you're getting your hair done, you're getting your nails done, you're calling a lawyer even, do you guys, maybe this room is primed to think this way in a way that most people are not. Do you first go to the state board and make sure that that person is a member in good standing of that particular profession? Have any of you done that before you've contacted a professional? Okay. How many of you have gone to Yelp? Okay, there are people that do this, right? How many of you have gone to Yelp? Right? How many of you solicited feedback from friends? How many of you, if you've had a bad experience, have gone and told people about it and said, stay away from that restaurant, or complained on Twitter or Facebook and all of these things? These are all regulations, right? That the market is regulating, competition is regulating in a way that, quite frankly, like the boards are not going to be able to achieve it, nor would they ever have the capacity to do so, because all of us have individual knowledge about the one-off interactions with these people that having a central location to try to do this is really, really unfeasible, and really gets in the way of these best case scenarios coming about.
So these are generally called, what you're referring to is the idea of sort of reputational feedback mechanisms, and we've done a little work on that. We wrote a law review article on that, and we've testified in the context of the sharing economy. And I wanted to turn to that really quickly for a couple of reasons, because what's happening in the sharing economy and ride sharing in particular is an interesting example of what we've called technological civil disobedience. That at the margins, when the regulatory accumulation and the red tape becomes so problematic, that we're starting to see some entrepreneurs just basically say, the heck with it. We're just going to go and do it. Now, that's a controversial and uncomfortable reality, because on one hand, some will decry the fact that that's lawlessness or law breaking or something. On the other hand, it's sort of the most purest form of innovation. You just, I'm going to be a go-getter and I'm going to go do this, damn all these old rules. And when I sometimes lecture in front of philosophy schools to be deliberately controversial or law programs, I'll say, what are Uber and Airbnb if not the biggest lawbreakers in America today? And God bless them for it. And just wait for the crowd to say, how do we read this? Because well, how many of you got here in an Uber today? How many of you stayed in Airbnb? I'm like, you're all lawbreakers then. You're the problem. You're the customer base.
Right.
So without getting into the ethics of this, because this is a thorny issue, there's a practical question here of, are we witnessing a breakdown of law? A breakdown of the rule of law, like when rules become so voluminous, so complicated, that people can't understand them, and both innovators and their consumers just basically flaunt them. Isn't that a sign that something horrible has happened?
I went to observe some hearings for applicants trying to start moving companies in Illinois. And this was some years ago, but it certainly stuck in my memory that I was watching a company describe their plans, and the administrative hearing officer said, well, have you started conducting moves yet? And one of the funny things about this is you can move people from Illinois to another state without this authorization, but you can't move people from one house on the street down the street. And these people said, we've only done interstate moves. We have not done any moves within the state of Illinois because we've been waiting for this authorization. And the administrative hearing officer said, I've never had someone in my hearing room who hadn't broken the law and been brought in because the company had been caught. And I do think the more complicated the rules are, the harder it is for people to know what they are, to comply, the less willing people are to put in the work to comply. And the whole goal of customer safety is actually undermined because you have lots and lots of people out there doing the work without any kind of registration or any kind of interaction with the safety rules. So that's one point I want to make. And another is, I think a lot of people do look at the example of Uber, and it's really brought some of these issues to light because it is permissionless, that kind of cowboy a tech entrepreneur running straight into kind of old school on the street licensing rules for taxi cabs. But some people I've heard say, you're not a real entrepreneur if you're not willing to just go full speed ahead in spite of the rules. You're not a real entrepreneur if you ask permission first. But what strikes me as someone who works with low-income entrepreneurs is that's kind of a position of privilege to be in when you can say, I'm going to act first and apologize if I get caught rather than asking permission. There are plenty of folks who don't have the kind of cushion in their lives to invest in a new business and
And they
take
don't have
that
a team
risk
of lawyers at their disposal to,
that they might
and a lot of
get caught
VC
and
venture
stopped.
capital money to back them up when they go to
Absolutely.
court. Chris, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is, as you put, the breakdown of law. I would say it's the breakdown in the rule of law. I mean, this is like a fundamental American principle that the law is accessible. We can go, we can see it. It's understandable, knowable, that we know if the law applies to us, and it's predictable. We know if it applies to us today, it's going to apply to us hopefully in the same way tomorrow. That I don't start doing something on a Tuesday and wake up on a Wednesday and find out that all of my investments and all of the activity I've done is now illegal. And I think that's really, especially in this regulatory accumulation, or in this red tape space, that's where you see it. In that, not only is it inaccessible, unknowable, and unpredictable for individuals, it's the same way for the people who are charged with enforcing the law. I mean, so back to the certificate of need example, we have all these surveys going back to 1980. So because of some federal law, I won't get into it, in 1980, every state had a certificate of need program. So starting in 1980 through the present, we can see how states compare year to year. And what we saw in these surveys, so these surveys were sent out every year going back to 1980, and the regulator would check a box, do you cover these healthcare items? MRI machines, CT scans, ambulatory surgery center, OB, open heart surgery, all sorts of stuff. And they check the box every year, they mail it back, and they produce this survey. These huge swings in states, year over year, without any bill being passed, without any executive order being ordered, simply because the person who was the regulator in charge of enforcing it interpreted the words differently. No one knew. I mean, you still go back and you can go to a state. I'm sure if you asked, people in Illinois, what do your laws that you're in charge with enforcing cover? You might get a shrug, a blank look. Let me Google that real quick. They would call their law clerk in and ask them some questions. But you end up in this position where it's no one's fault. Like, no one's to blame here. No one intended to do this, but you have this issue where it's, only particular people are now in a position to take advantage of this uncertainty, and we can't even get the people who are charged with enforcing the laws to do it consistently and predictably, because they don't even, quite frankly, know everything that's included in the laws they're asked to enforce.
So in a moment here, we need to go to audience Q&A, but before that, any concluding brief thoughts about what Illinois can do specifically to get this process started? We've heard some good ideas today from Laura and James and others, and are there anything in particular you think, is there any low-hanging fruit or any priority objectives that the state should consider to get this going?
Well, I do work with entrepreneurs in Chicago every day, and I can tell you they are passionate, they're determined, and they really want to do things right. And so anything we can do to change the culture, to change the attitudes, to embrace their creativity and their energy, and to launch them to experiment and to serve customers instead of writing their business plans for them or looking over their shoulders, we've really got to do to make Illinois successful, from the corner store in the inner city to the farmer using kind of new techniques downstate. And so my advice to those of you who are taking on the amazingly important role of scouring the codes is to look for rules that are general. For moving companies, maybe you could require that they disclose their prices before they pack away someone's property, instead of saying you have to price this way, in these formulae, in this thick tariff book. And by simplifying and keeping the focus only on the actual health and safety or consumer protection goal, you'll leave room for the entrepreneurs to do what they do best, which is create and innovate and get to know their customers and what their customers need, and build businesses and create jobs.
Chris, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I would say, as you all are doing this, you're doing yeoman's work, right? Really, really tough stuff. But I would say, it comes down to just a few simple questions. Easier for me to say because I don't have to do it. But I think it comes down to three really easy questions when you're looking at a occupational license or a rule or a regulation or something. Is, what did you hope to achieve? is it achieving that thing? And has the market changed since we wrote the law in such a way that it's being done without the need for the law anyway? I mean, oftentimes these laws are decades and decades and decades old. The market has dramatically changed, even from 5 years ago, even 6 months ago. Things are dramatically changing in real time, and being able to look and saying, what did we want to achieve? Are we achieving them? In, is this something we even have to do anymore? Because it takes the pressure off of, people in government, and takes the pressure, quite frankly, off of everyone in this room, is to try to make 1960 fit into 2015, or even worse, make 2017 fit into 1960.
I think that's right, and I think it's one of the reasons I'm a fan of the approach that Illinois is taking here and other states are taking, and looking also at the idea of sunsetting a lot of rules or sort of regulatory look back. It's really important that we require our government to consider, how fresh laws are. We live in a world, a modern technological world governed by Moore's law, the idea that the power of a semiconductor basically doubles roughly every 18 months to 2 years, and the price falls in half. And that forces businesses and entrepreneurs to be constantly reinventing the wheel and thinking about that new, different way of doing things. Essentially, their business models are being sunset now on a regular basis. And yet the laws that govern these things don't. And so that's why I'm a big fan of the idea of having some sort of a regulatory look back or house cleaning on occasion, and sunsetting, or sort of 1 in, 1 out, or 2 in, 1 out, whatever it may be, is a nice way to go about starting that process, getting it going. And it doesn't entail the elimination of all regulations. I think it's always important to start, as we all did today, by taking that off the table. Nobody's talking about that. It actually allows you to focus on what's really important and what really is a public, necessity, as opposed to just something that's been on the books and it's a crusty old rule and it's been there forever, so we got to enforce it. These things need to change. So I think we're ready for Q&A. I believe you're going to moderate that.
Bryce? Do we have any questions?
Yeah, Christine Leah, if you guys wanted to submit any more, I have a couple as an audience member I was trying to think of while they were presenting, but we're happy to ask yours as well. And I'll bring Laura and James back into the discussion. Laura, you told a very, very interesting story on British Columbia. Certainly British Columbia is a little different than Illinois, and there's probably some bumps around on the road as you were going through these reforms. Are there maybe some specific ideas for Illinois, and maybe some specific lessons learned, or something maybe that didn't go well in British Columbia, that maybe you could offer insights for that could improve outcomes here?
Yeah, I think let me start by saying that, it sounds like British Columbia and Illinois were in similar situations in terms of having just a lot of rules that really didn't make sense and are really kind of choking the things that we care about in terms of creating prosperity and jobs and entrepreneurship and innovation and all of those things. So I think there's a lot of similarities. But there are some differences too. Illinois is not implementing right away a 1 in, 2 out kind of policy, and so that's a challenge. I think that one of the things that is incredibly important, and I know I'm listening to Beth's stories, and it's captivating to listen to stories. I think it's really important that people get engaged in telling stories and telling their own stories. And as small an action as that is, there are lots of great ways to tell stories now, through Twitter, through Facebook, through organizations and associations. And I think it's really through the media, through op-eds, I think it's really important to create that culture where the general public understands, because I agree that everyone is affected by red tape, but not everybody knows they're affected by red tape. And that's really, really important, because as a just average citizen, you're not necessarily aware of the struggle of the immigrant who's starting a moving company and what that means to you. You may be aware that, wow, the pricing seems complicated, but that's kind of a small irritant. When we fill out our tax forms, we may get annoyed by the language being complicated, or that it's so complex that we have to pay someone else to do it for us. We might get annoyed if we have to wait for our driver's license, wait in line for the driver's license, but we don't have that many direct interfaces with red tape. So I think the telling stories is really, and getting examples is really important to create the culture for more of the kind of change that's and that seems to me the where Illinois is really starting.
Thank you for the opportunity to say something, because I do want to say something on this front, because one thing that could really drive this project is increasing the public participation and soliciting comments from the public, because that's where we identify the opportunities. We understand there's a red tape problems in Illinois, but unless and until the public shares with us what your stories are, what your sufferings are, we do not know of those opportunities. Not until I sat here today did I know about the moving company story as it relates to the Illinois Commerce Commission. And now we will look at it. But again, the driving force has to be the general public, because you are the ones who suffer from the problems. So whatever ways in which that we can heighten the public participation, that is going to be the key for this project to work. And just so that all of us in this, sitting in this room is aware as to the framework of the Illinois Competitiveness Council, we do have a one-in, one-out policy. And actually, we have an ambitious goal of trying to reduce regulation in 2017. And from beyond that, then we will look at specific issues starting in 2018 and beyond. So we do have a goal of 20% to reduce that in 1 year.
And just one last thing on that, it's the stories that will help institutionalize. One of the things you talked about is the institutionalization of the reforms and not having it be something that we do for a couple of years and then we forget about. It's that creates the climate that then the policies of legislating one in, one out, for example, and making it more permanent. So that's why it's so important that people understand.
I would add that many of my clients have kind of folks in Illinois agencies on speed dial because they have so many questions and have had wonderful interactions with patient folks working for the state of Illinois trying to explain how to fill out the form, when the inspection will take place, how things will work. And so I think if people in Illinois government are keeping track of those interactions, closing out those emails or phone calls with a question, is this a problem for you? Do you think we could do it better? Kind of tallying up, gee, everybody applying this year has been confused about X, Y, or Z. Those kinds of inputs, I think, will be so helpful for finding the places where reform is needed.
Leslie.
Can I just make a couple of comments? Because I know we have a lot of people here who can make a difference in their agencies as well as bring ideas forward. We've heard a lot of information about stories, but I think it's important for us all to remember that turn around. I think we heard Laura talk about the growth change. And really, this is why we are talking. This is why we have this project, because Illinois is lagging growth of surrounding states. Our economy is flat. We all know, we're all well aware of the budget issues that we have in the state. We have a very large economy in Illinois, and a small change in growth, a small change in putting people to work, yields a lot of revenue for the state. And so this is not just an exercise to make things easier for people to navigate the state. This is an exercise in jumpstarting our economy to bring in the kind of revenues that allows us to fund the critical things in the state, to get out of debt, to pay for the things that we need to pay for. And so every time we make it easier for someone to create a company, every time we take cost out of a process because we found a way to do it faster, cheaper, better, and make it easier for people to get through and get their businesses done, it encourages businesses to stay here, to expand, to come here to build, to take that cost out of regulatory efforts, and instead put a person to work. And that is what changes our economy. And small changes in Illinois, if we were just able to grow comparably to Indiana and Michigan in the past year as $1 billion additional revenue to our economy, $1 billion. So this is big numbers because of the size of the state. And this is why this is so important. And I just think it's important for us all to remember, this is not, we're talking a lot about cutting red tape, but it's a way to get to economic growth in the state that generates revenue to pay for the things that are critical to help people educate our children, pay for public safety, great roads, everything that we're trying to do.
Thank you.
Maybe James, on that point, are there some studies maybe that you've worked on or that the Committee Center worked on or elsewhere that ties actual relationships to regulatory reductions to economic growth? There's some stuff that we can point to.
Sure. So there isn't very much at the state level in the United States, but there's been a number of studies in the past few years focusing on federal regulation and economic growth. So there was a study in 2013 in the Journal of Economic Growth, which is a very good economics journal, that estimated that since 1949, federal regulation has slowed U.S. GDP growth by about 2% a year. We have one of my colleagues, Patrick McLaughlin at the Mercatus Center, has estimated that federal regulation slows growth by about 0.8% per year. So those are some bounds, maybe 1 to 2% might be some of the better estimates out there. There have been some World Bank studies that estimate that going from a top ranking or going from one of the most highest regulatory burden countries to lowest speeds up economic growth by about 2% a year. So these are some of the estimates we see. 2% is probably something that's achievable in terms of regulatory reform. And I just want to emphasize again that may not sound like a lot, but compounding year after year after year, this really can lead to huge differences in living standards over a period of decades or over a century or something like that.
Great. And then when you were showing going through the restrictions, the ideas of the state administrator, could you elaborate on what those restrictions are? What is it that you're finding when you're going through the administrative codes that result in different findings from the states? What are they?
So in general, we're finding a lot of similarities in terms of the types of regulation that are the biggest areas of regulation across the state. So environmental regulation, public health related regulation, healthcare regulation, food safety regulation. These are some of the areas that seem to be the most regulated, and that seems to be true across states. So really the difference between Illinois and the other states is just that there seems to be a bigger quantity of regulation, not really a different mix or a different proportion. It's just that there's more regulation on the books. So this suggests that maybe, it could be that the institutional structure of the system in Illinois makes it easy to put rules on the books, but harder maybe to remove them. That's possible. But it's not clear exactly why Illinois has so much regulation at this point. It's something that we're definitely looking to study more.
Great, thanks. Maybe we can bring Beth back into the conversation then. Maybe if you were one of Laura's regulatory managers as opposed to a maker, maybe there's a top few that you would recommend here to people in the room that you could target as, here's an idea for tangible reform in Illinois. Here's 2 or 3 of them, and why?
Well, I know this has been a difficult problem to solve, but I do think workers' compensation insurance is something that affects all entrepreneurs, all business owners in Illinois. I think a lot of the reporting focuses on kind of big factories and how they might spend 50 cents more per employee or $3 more per employee than a similar company in Indiana. But I think taking our example of a moving company that's just blows those numbers out of the water shows that for those startups, it's just a killer. There have been some studies also on the effect of occupational licensing on the health of the economy, and so that's really an area to take a hard look. It's not all the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. We have a client that does babysitter scheduling and is regulated by the Department of Labor as an employment placement agency. We have a client who has decided to start a caregiver business, another business that someone with a lot of heart but not a lot of money might get into in providing care and companionship for senior citizens or disabled folks. That licensing process is extremely complex. That's in the Department of Health. So taking a hard look at any of those laws that are licensing people, that are putting all of these requirements on them before they can even put kind of the sign up that they're open for business, that's a really important place to start.
Great, yeah, and I think you're making a point of have your rulemaking be outcome-based as opposed to specific processes. I think that's a great takeaway. To jump over to Chris next, you talked about certificate of need laws, and they're broad in scope and in a lot of states across the country. there's a lot of justifications for these, though, that they maybe improve quality or they improve outcomes in some way. I know you've worked on that subject before. Are there some points on like cost, quality, supply of care that you found that getting rid of certificate of need laws has a positive effect or negative effect?
These have been justified in a number of ways. Certificate of need laws are as a way to control costs, as a way to increase access in underserved communities, as a way to increase the quality, as a way to increase charity care, indigent care, so non-payer people who walk into a hospital without insurance, hospitals can't turn them away. These regulations have been justified to achieve all of that. Not all at once, but every time, the evidence becomes clear that one of these justifications doesn't suffice anymore, then a new one pops up. It's sort of like playing justification whack-a-mole. As a researcher, every time we think we've sufficiently debunked one claim, a new one comes up again. But what you find is across the board, the findings are as consistent as they are disappointing. Certificate of need not only fails to achieve these, oftentimes it's undermining these goals. You see higher healthcare costs, you see lower access, you see lower quality in terms of mortality and readmission rates, right? People are really being impacted by these in a very real way. This isn't like dollars and cents. This isn't business A versus business B. This is people who are walking or driving into healthcare providers and are being affected. Like their life is being affected because of a lack of a competition means that providers don't have to, right? Because none of us actually pay for healthcare. Insurance does. We're sort of insulated from the price. Typically, the way that providers compete is on these non-cost margins. How well do they provide bedside manner and how well of care is given to you? That's sort of how you measure your doctor, not did they charge you more or less. And what you find is people in certificate of need states actually rate their hospitals lower. Like, so you go to Yelp and you look at consumer ratings, and actually as ratings go, people are consistently more unhappy in the heavily regulated environment than the less regulated environment, and their outcomes are worse in the regulated environment. These were supposed to protect and save people, but instead they're leaving them more vulnerable and with fewer options and paying more for less.
Great, and I know we're getting tight on time. Well, I do have a couple more here that came in. James, you talked about the JCAR program, the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules. Are there maybe you maybe talk a little bit more about some other examples from other states and maybe the effects that they've had, or maybe some changes that you'd recommend for JCAR to be maybe more in line with what the Competitiveness Council is trying to do?
Sure. So I know at least a dozen or so states over the last few decades have experimented with something called a legislative veto, which essentially means that regulations are reviewed by the legislature or a committee in the legislature, which has the authority to override or block regulations without the consent of the governor. And so this raises questions about whether this is unconstitutional or violates the separation of powers in some way. And it will vary from state to state depending on the state constitution. I believe the only state that has a very strict form of this policy is Idaho at the moment, and their courts seem to have kind of dodged this issue to some extent, but it seems like it may be constitutional in Idaho. But other states, like I believe Kentucky used to have a policy like this in place, and basically what happened there was they just changed the authority of the legislature to just be able to make non-binding recommendations. Now, it can be embarrassing to a regulatory agency if you get a formal letter from the review committee in the legislature that says, we think this is a problem. And that's often enough to spur the regulatory agencies to make changes. And so usually there aren't serious conflicts. But it's when you add this veto power to the legislative committee that then it becomes kind of a question legally. So I'm not an attorney, I'm an economist, so I'm not necessarily an expert in this area, but the easiest reform that could resolve any potential constitutional questions would just be to say that they could make non-binding recommendations without having a veto authority.
Great, yeah, so I had one more come in for Laura, and then maybe we could end with Adam on a send-off note. Laura, any last advice that you might have to be able to get buy-in from some of our friends here that are working with the agencies and trying to make these reforms happen. Any last-minute advice you'd like to offer everyone here in Illinois?
Well, I think I've already talked about the importance of telling stories, but I want to emphasize, too, the importance of those working in government. And change is not easy for anyone. And the job, really, of regulators has been to make more regulations. And there's been a lot of incentives created around that. So I think thinking very carefully about, as you're changing that incentive from regulation maker to regulation manager, to find ways to recognize and acknowledge the hard work that goes on. Though the staff in the regulatory agencies are often in the best position to identify where some of these groups of rules are, because they're not identifying them, as someone said, one at a time. They're hearing a bunch of problems come in. So really engaging them and being part of the solution and finding really sincere ways to do that, both from the private sector and, I would say, within the public sector. I think one of the things that the BC government could have done a better job of is rewarding people within government who are, and it doesn't have to be big. It can be, a personal thank you from the governor, or a special little, pin, or we give out teddy bears because they are related to a red tape story that was solved, and we give them to the bureaucrats. And I can tell you, both politicians and civil servants, they rarely hear these two words, thank you. And the power of those two words is incredible. And that can then really start your reform spreading, and it turns it into something that, and in BC they were very, very opposed to it at the beginning, but I think the kind of the incentives started to change, and there were more thank yous certainly coming from the private sector. I think that that's important to remember. Yes, bring forward the problems, but also remember to say thank you when people are doing good things, because it's not easy work on the other side.
Great, yeah, and then maybe just to end it here, Adam, if you wanted to offer, I know you started with a quote about getting to a goal of a more free and prosperous society. What do you see going forward, that can, both at the national level, but maybe here in Illinois, what they can do, we can end on a positive note here, an uplifting message of what to do going forward, and maybe with what Mercatus Center can provide for everyone here going forward.
Well, the positive note is that the process is underway, and that's great news. And I want to applaud everybody who had something to say here today in a leadership capacity, because it's so important that we send the right signals when it comes to innovation policy and regulatory reform. The politics of regulatory reform are really, really tricky, and it really comes down to getting signals right and providing the right sort of vision to really make it happen. The most successful regulatory reform experience of my lifetime, the last 50 years, happened in the Carter administration, when they comprehensively reformed very inefficient anti-consumer transportation and aviation regulations. And really, it came down to 3 or 4 crucial people: the President Carter himself, Senator Ted Kennedy, and a few other people who came together, including Stephen Breyer before he was on the Supreme Court, who was in the Senate at the time, working as an aide. And they came together along with the head of an important regulatory agency, Naomi Alfred Khan, and they said, we need to do this. We need to signal that we're going to do this, that it's okay, that we're going to improve regulation to benefit consumers. We're going to start giving entrepreneurs the green light to do interesting, new, innovative things without all this burdensome red tape. And we're also going to tell our civil servants and our regulators we can find a better way to deal with the serious issues that we've been charged with dealing with in the past. And I think we as a nation are better off because of that experience, because it did lead to more innovation, competition, and then by extension, economic growth and human well-being. So what we do at Mercatus is we try to connect those dots. We try to provide the economic evidence and legal support to basically explain how to go about doing these things. But the thing that we can't do, that really comes down to a leadership thing for our political leaders from the governor on down to do, is to provide that vision. To provide that vision and that signal both to entrepreneurs and to the civil servants and the regulators to say, it's okay, we can change, we can do this, we can get through and find a better, happy ground for all of us.
Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to our panel of speakers.
Thank
Robin.
you.